So, thanks for joining me again, David. Much sooner than I had planned or anticipated. I had 2 other interviews planned this week, and both of them had to rain check on me for various reasons, for just work things came up or technical issues or whatever. So, it was not my plan to have you back on here so soon. I wanted to spread out our conversations to be further apart. I was going to have you on later down the road after I had several other people on and whatever, but looks like episode 1 and episode 3 is going to be David Pallmann. So
your audience is just going to get sick of me.
Yeah, if they aren't already. I mean,
Yep,
you are the Dillard's apologist. So, I don't know why anybody's listening to this, being that you work at Dillard's. You couldn't possibly know anything.
James White has proven it.
Yes, James White the Great. That was such a funny interaction. I was like, man, I already was frustrated with the way that he treated people, but then that was just like, are you kidding me? Like, you're gonna be that petty? You're just gonna attack somebody because they work at Dillard's? Like, he didn't even address your statements or anything. He was just like, that guy works at Dillard's, so he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's like,
That is James White's a smart guy. So if he has an argument, he makes it. When he doesn't have an argument, then he just kind of tries to
yeah.
show that you have no standing or whatever to talk about anything.
Yeah, I love it whenever Leighton has dealt with him so much, and he goes, okay, maybe I'm the dumbest guy in the world. Now answer my question. Like, answer the objection. I don't care how smart I am. Just give me an answer. So yeah, it's fun. Now, speaking of which, why don't we do this? I forgot to do this last time. I didn't do it. Didn't think it was super necessary, but I actually had some feedback. Why don't you tell people that are listening who might not be familiar with you, why it is that I might have you on here? What's your background? What do you do? And then also, why might you be somebody that I would want to talk on the subjects that we're going to deal with today?
Yeah, well, I'm a Dillard's employee is probably the most important thing about me. I work as an engineer for Dillard's stores. But probably more relevantly, I do have a bachelor's degree in ministry and apologetics from Trinity Theological Seminary. I'm kind of an autodidact in that I'm not really like a scholar in any field, but I do have my areas of interest that I try to be well read in. And I do YouTube stuff on my channel called Faith Because of Reason, where basically it's video essays on various theological, philosophical, or apologetic topics, where I kind of put most of my thoughts out there in the form of video essays. So that's a little about me.
Yeah, and I mean, you read an insane amount as well. So it's always helpful. I said this last time as well, but like, whenever I have an issue or a new subject that I'm dealing with, typically I'll text you and be like, hey, like I did today, like, hey, who are your favorite philosophers on this topic, or your favorite apologists on this issue, and what are the various sides, and who gives the strongest case for both sides of this issue or whatever? Because I figured most of usually it's a subject I know you've dealt with, but even if you haven't read it, you're at least probably familiar with it. And you're like, oh yeah, I know these guys have good resources or whatever. So, um, you're a good reference for those kind of things. But
I'm also an expensive friend to have. I'm told just because of how many books I post online, and I'm like, oh, y'all gotta get this.
yeah, I think the most expensive book I had seen you post, this is a long time ago, that really caught me off guard, there was one that was like $100, which I know that's, as far as like scholarly materials goes, people put out their dissertation or publish their dissertations and things. Usually those run for a couple $100. And so back then I saw this book and I was like, oh my goodness, this is an expensive book. But what is the most expensive book that you have?
The most that I've ever actually spent on a book is 125. But well, that's actually not completely true. I talked my wife into letting me buy a $600 set recently, but those are it's a little bit of a special case because they're like leather bound, limited to 1,000, like 22 karat gold inlays, and so that's a collector's edition. The most expensive, like just academic book that I have was 125 that I actually spent on it. Now I do have books that are worth like $300, $400, $500 that I've been able to find for much lower prices. But yeah, 125 is the most I've ever actually spent on an academic book.
Nice. Now, are you one of those guys that has read every book on his shelf, or do you collect them and then get to them eventually?
I have read most of them, at least in some capacity. There are like some reference works, like some commentaries and like encyclopedia type things. I don't read those front to back.
What?
But yeah, so shocker, right? But most of my books, I have at least, you know, read a chapter or read, got the basic gist of it, if I haven't read it completely.
Who was it that said that life's too short to read bad books?
The thing is, part of my job as a Christian apologist, it kind of comes with the territory because I have to interact with what the critics of Christianity are saying. So I have to read a lot of bad books, but there is a lot of truth to that because one of the saddest moments of my life was when I realized I would not live long enough to read like all of the books that I actually want to read. And on top of that, I have to waste some of my time reading like absolute trash books.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so hard for me sometimes. I go to read a book and I'm like, I want to finish reading the book. The book is like, it's not all there, it's not everything that you want it to be. And I want to finish the book because I'm like, I want to have engaged with the whole thing that the author's saying, but then I'm also like, but if I waste my time reading this and I know it's already garbage, then I'm wasting what I could have spent reading something that was actually worthwhile. And there's that wrestle, there's that tension there. All right, so the subject that we're going to talk about today, the synoptic problem and Matthean priority specifically is the position that you've taken on this. Sorry to spoil the punchline here, but this is something I've been seeing you posting about on your YouTube channel, talking about. You've gotten into a couple debates, and I have been really curious about what your arguments are for this because everything that I've heard, everything I've read or seen, popular apologists have said, things like that, what we were taught in school, is that um, Mark was the first gospel written. And I saw you started doing a ton of study on this a couple of years ago and then came to a different conclusion. And I've been really intrigued by that and listened to a debate that you had. I had a lot of high hopes for it, and it was it didn't quite meet the standard that I would have liked for a good debate. It was mostly like trust me, bro, and this is what they taught me at Harvard. So if anybody wants to that is listening to this conversation or whatever, I've already said I'm open to hosting debates on here. I think that would be really cool, or moderated conversations. Those can be just as edifying, just some Socratic, interactions. Um, if anybody really knows their stuff and wants to genuinely and like honestly interact with your arguments, I would love to host a debate on any particular subject that you have or whatever. The problem I have is a lot of debates. People are not interested in really understanding the other person's arguments or position. They just basically like, oh, well, this is my position, so I'm going to argue in circles around it. And if the other person brings up a genuine or legitimate problem, they fail to interact with it. They just usually it's people build straw men and they don't actually engage with the material. And so I would love to have some quality debates on here. So that means I'm probably going to vet and say, like, if somebody comes and says, hey, I want to debate you on this topic, and they're not going to do a good job, like actually engaging the arguments, I'm going to be like, life's too short for bad debates. so, so just throwing that out there. But the synoptic problem. Why don't we start with you? Why don't you explain to us what is the synoptic problem and why does it matter? Why should we even care? What are we doing here?
Sure. So let's say up front that synoptic problem is probably a little bit of an unfortunate term for it. Probably the better term would be synoptic puzzle, because we're not trying to say that there's like a problem with the synoptic gospels or anything like that. So hopefully nobody's eyebrows get raised too much for that. But the verbiage that's kind of become standard is just to refer to this as the synoptic problem. So that tends to be the language that I use. But again, in saying that, I'm not saying that there's like problem with these gospels. Basically, what it is a question to try to determine the literary relationships between the first three canonical gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Uh, Basically, the mainstream view is that there is some degree of literary dependence among these three documents. And what literary dependence means is that two of the synoptic authors depended on one or both of the other synoptic gospels in the composition of their own. And the primary reason for thinking this is just that there is a lot of what's called literary, or rather, a lot of verbatim agreements between the Gospels. So you've got a whole bunch of word for word correspondences. Now, some people say, well, maybe this could, be explained by people. The Gospel authors are relaying Jesus's exact words, right? They're getting it so accurate that that's why they match up in these exact ways. That could sound plausible, except Jesus probably didn't speak Greek, which is what our canonical Gospels are written in. He probably spoke Aramaic. That would have been the sort of language of conversation in ancient Israel at that time. And so his words are being translated by the Gospel authors into Greek. And the odds that they're all going to make the exact same translational choices this much kind of strains credulity. Beyond that, we also have verbatim agreements, not just in the quotations of Jesus, but we also have them in like the narrator's comments. For example, there is a statement in both Mark and Matthew where there's this aside in the passage where it's like a break in Jesus's words, and the narrator says like, "Let the reader understand." So he's talking to the reader. So this isn't something that you can explain as the result of oral tradition or something that you can explain as the result of them just verbatim getting Jesus's words right. It suggests that there's some sort of literary dependence among them. And so the synoptic problem is basically just the attempt to find out what is the relationship, which gospel's first, which one is second, which one is third. And so to a lot of Christians, they're like, I believe it's all the inspired word of God, right? So why should we care? Like, who cares what the order is? We have them; they're inspired. That's the main thing, right? Uh, and in the context of church, I mean, that's perfectly fine, right? If you're preaching an expository sermon, the literary relationship probably won't matter that much. But when you are trying to engage in something like Christian apologetics, where we're trying to sort of base our faith on the historical trustworthiness of these documents, then the question becomes important. Because, like, one big issue is, all right, who wrote the Gospels, right? I believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. One big reason that I believe that is because everybody in the early church, our earliest historical witnesses, tell us that they are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But critical scholars, or skeptical scholars, perhaps we should say, they don't tend to believe that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so you kind of say, well, what do you do with this evidence? And one of their big objections is, well, it's just not reliable because look, they all say that Matthew is the first gospel to have been written, but we just know Mark is the first gospel to have been written. So, like, we know that they're wrong about this.
Where do
Like,
they say? Where do the you talking about early church fathers?
correct.
Where do they say this?
I mean, I can pull up the specific citations if you want, but
Yeah,
it's
if you have them on hand, that'd be sweet.
yeah. Let me pull up in my notes here. Okay, so here our earliest witness is going to be Irenaeus. He says Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
That's fascinating. I have never seen that before, and I mean, Irenaeus would be one to know. He would have had direct connection with some of these people.
or at least like one removed through Polycarp.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
Polycarp,
yeah. He would have been really, really, really close to those who would know.
right? Another witness would be here, Clement of Alexandria. He says, quote, the earliest written gospels were those containing the genealogies, and the gospel according to Mark came into being in this manner. And he goes on and gives the story of how Mark came to be. But I mean, he clearly says that Luke and Matthew are the two earliest gospels to have been written. We go a little bit later into church history, and we get Tertullian. Well, I don't think Tertullian really says anything about the order. We have Origen. So Origen says, among the four gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the first written was that according to Matthew, who was once a tax collector, but afterward an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it for those who from Judaism came to believe, composed as it was in the Hebrew language. Secondly, that according to Mark, who composed it in accordance with the instructions of Peter, who is the Catholic epistle, or who in the Catholic epistle acknowledges him as a son. And thirdly, that according to Luke, for those who from the Gentiles came to believe, after them all, that according to John. We have the same thing turn up later in Augustine. The point is, we've got this unanimity among the patristic witnesses, among the church fathers, that Matthew is the first gospel to have been written. And so, one big reason why skeptical scholars will reject their testimony to the authorship of the Gospels is because they think, well, they're just wrong about the order of the Gospels. So, if we don't trust them about the order of the Gospels, because we just know Mark is the first Gospel to have been written, why would we trust them about the authorship of the Gospels? That was kind of the issue that got me interested in it, because I started seeing, okay, it's actually relevant to the issue of Christian apologetics. It's not just, I believe that they're all inspired, so the order doesn't matter. If I'm going to defend inspiration, based on the historical veracity of Jesus Christ and his claims, and part of that involves defending that the Gospels actually come from eyewitnesses or the immediate followers of eyewitnesses, then I have a reason to look into the synoptic problem. And so that's sort of what started my own interest in the issue.
Interesting. So you're saying that as you've dug into this, I mean, at a cursory glance at this issue, people are like, okay, what's the big deal? They're all inspired. We accept them, whatever. However, whenever it gets into defending the authorship to, say, skeptics or atheists or whatever, somebody that's challenging and saying, well, we don't believe that the gospel's written by the gospel authors, they were forged later or whatever, they're saying that you're saying that one of the defenses to give to that is to say, oh, well, look, the early church fathers knew who wrote them, and so therefore that they would be in position to know they were the earliest witnesses to the handing down of those documents. But then the response to that has been, okay, but the church fathers say that Matthew was written first, and yet you say that Mark was written first. So if you can't trust them on who wrote first, then why are you trusting them on the authorship? Am I understanding your
Yeah,
position
and,
correctly?
and to be clear, that's not the only objection that they will have, but that is certainly one that they'll put out there. Is basically, look, they're wrong. We know they're wrong on the order, so they're probably wrong on the authors as well. And there's other apologetic issues that are significant here. One of these is the deity of Christ. So I don't agree with this, but allegedly Mark is supposed to have what's called the lowest Christology. So like Jesus is kind of just this Superman in Mark, and like by the time we get to John, he's God, and so we see it evolve a little bit in Matthew and a little more in Luke. Same thing with the resurrection. They'll be like, well, there's no resurrection appearances in Mark because, of course, they assume that the long ending of Mark um, is not accurate. So it just ends with the women leaving the tomb and there's no appearances of Jesus. They say, well, look, it gets a little more incredible in Matthew, a little more incredible in Luke, and like very incredible in John, where we've got Jesus, having his wounds touched by Thomas and whatnot. So like you can see the legend evolving. So there's really all kinds of like skeptical arguments that are predicated upon the priority of the Gospel of Mark. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think like you have to abandon Christianity if Markan priority is true. So it's not like the historical case for Christianity is sunk if Markan priority turns out to be true. But at the same time, I think for independent reasons, I think Matthean priority is true. And as a bonus of that, it has a whole lot of apologetic benefits.
Interesting. Yeah. So the if you're going to defend the idea of early attestation by the gospel writers of Christ's divinity, then this is also helpful in that realm, because typically the argument goes, well, starts off in Mark, really, really simple. Jesus isn't really that much of a, deity in any sense, which I think Wesley Huff actually recently did a good job of very concisely disproving that. He went chapter by chapter and just rattled off the way that the authors are representing Jesus as God. And I think the majority of people who say that any particular gospel doesn't present Jesus as God just doesn't understand how that particular literary genre works, especially in that time. And so I would just challenge them to know how to read better. But that's a separate subject that I would love to get into on my channel sometime, is just how to read and understand the Bible properly, hermeneutics. But essentially, these people are saying, well, Mark was written first, and you have a lower Christology, and then what was it? Is it Luke or Matthew that they say comes second?
Typically, they'll want to say Matthew is second.
They'll say Matthew second, then Luke, and then John. And as you see that progression through history, you see this progression of Christ's deity. But if you end up with Matthew being first, it kind of dismantles that, because Mark supposedly has a lower Christology than Matthew does, which means that it couldn't have grown over time, because Matthew would have. So it kind of just disrupts that entire thought
And
process.
to be clear, like, I think the deity of Christ and thing, I think that is perfectly defensible from the Gospel of Mark.
I
So
agree. Yeah.
again, it's not like you don't have to stake your apologetic on the priority of Matthew. I want to be upfront. You can believe that Mark is the first gospel written and still give a very strong case for the truth of Christianity. But a lot of these skeptical objections are like stopped dead in their tracks for completely independent reasons if their synoptic theory is wrong in the first place. And so that's kind of the apologetic value of the synoptic problem as I see it.
So it just helps you get a little further down the road, automatically, without having to deal with all these extra frivolous objections. Okay, cool. Okay, so then why don't you give us kind of an overview of what the different synoptic theories are and the positions that are kind of all competing here?
Sure. So there's a whole, I mean, the literature on this is pretty vast and it's constantly evolving. But so I'm not going to necessarily get every position out here. But here are kind of the four main contenders are going to be what the first one is going to be called the two source hypothesis. So the two source hypothesis begins with Markan priority. So Mark is the first gospel written. There's this independent source that has been lost to us today that's called Q. And then you have Matthew comes second. Matthew pulls from both Mark and Q. And then you have Luke. Luke is independent of Matthew. So Luke doesn't know that the Gospel of Matthew exists, but Luke also pulls from both Mark and Q. And so what this is supposed to explain is material that is common to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All of that comes from Mark on this view. And then the idea that, or the stuff that Matthew and Luke share in common, Luke isn't getting that from Matthew. Instead, they're both getting that independently from this source called Q. And so that's the two source hypothesis. For the 20th century, like, this was the solution to the synoptic problem. This was like basically this was like almost orthodoxy in biblical studies. So the two source hypothesis was, I believe it was called it was famously called the assured result of biblical scholarship. Is that you've got Mark, you've got Q, and then Matthew and Luke both come from that.
And when did this idea kind of first start?
So this is something like late 19th century,
Also,
earliest
very
20,
late.
yeah, early 20th century. A scholar by the name of B.H. Streeter, who's writing like very early 20th century. He's the one who really like started propelling this theory forward, and when it started picking up a lot of traction in biblical scholarship, to the point that up until like later in the 20th century, it was almost just taken for granted. And I mean, even today, you can just find biblical scholars. I mean, even evangelical ones like Gary Habermas, unfortunately, just almost always takes this for granted in his writings. But that's sort of historically when it comes onto the scene is very late 19th century, early 20th century. The first argument I take on is going to be Streeter's favorite, so I will come back to that. But a second one, and this is one that's actually becoming very popular nowadays, is called the Ferrer-Golder hypothesis. So this one says, look, we don't have any evidence that this document Q ever existed. Like, it's not mentioned in any sources. We don't have it today. It's pure conjecture. All things being equal, we want a simpler hypothesis. Get Q out of here. But it keeps Mark in priority. So it says Mark is the first gospel written. It says Matthew knew the gospel of Mark, so information common to both that comes to Matthew. And then Luke, instead of knowing this hypothetical Q source, Luke just knew Matthew. So the information common to all three comes, through Mark to Matthew and then through Matthew to Luke. So that would be the Ferrer-Golder hypothesis. That's probably the second most popular. I think the two source hypothesis is still the most popular solution, but this is definitely like you can't just take the two source hypothesis for granted anymore because the Ferrer-Golder hypothesis is a very popular alternative to it these days. And I think that starts coming into play like mid 20th century and starts really picking up steam late 20th century and 21st century.
Okay. And then, so the first hypothesis is the Q. Like, there's this fourth extra document that they're all three, or I guess Matthew and Luke are pulling from.
Yes, and Mark is
and they're borrowing from Mark as well. And then the Ferrer-Gold hypothesis,
Ferrer-Golder, like shoulder.
Golder, okay, is going to be there is no Q. Matthew, Mark, and Luke just kind of all knew each other and pulled from each other's sources.
Yeah, so it'd be Mark, Matthew, Luke, but yeah.
So then, what would be the other alternative viewpoint?
So those would be the two most popular examples of theories that embrace Markan priority, that Mark is first. The other alternative to that is Matthean priority. So the traditional version of Matthean priority is called the Augustinian hypothesis. And this says basically that the order that you find in your Bible, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, that's the order that they were written in, plain and simple. So Matthew's written first, Mark pulls from Matthew, and Luke pulls from both of them. And so that's what explains it. It's called the Augustinian hypothesis because allegedly, and maybe we'll get into this later, allegedly Augustine believed in this hypothesis. I think there's actually some evidence to challenge that he actually believed in my hypothesis instead. But that would be the Augustinian hypothesis. And when I first started looking into this, I thought that's where I was going to end up. I thought I would end up rejecting Markan priority because I thought the evidence for that was pretty weak. And I really wanted to take the evidence from the Church Fathers seriously. And so I thought, well, that's clearly going to make me an Augustinian, right? Well, it turns out it didn't. So this fourth hypothesis is the one that I hold to, and this is called the Griesbach or the two gospel hypothesis. And so on this view, Matthew is written first, Luke is written second, and then Mark is written third. So it kind of takes Markan priority and flips it on its head. It says instead of being written first, Mark is actually written last. And that's the view that I ended up taking.
Interesting. Okay, because this is what I've always heard, is that basically Mark is written, it's really short and sweet and fast, and it looks as though he wrote it really quickly just to get it down and get it out to the world, and he was the very first one to basically let the people know about the gospel and Jesus is coming and all of that. So I'm curious as to what the defense of this position is and what each of these different positions that you've just laid out, what prompted them coming about, and what is their defense of what are the reasons that they give for these positions?
Yeah, well, and I'll definitely get into my reasons for holding to the thesis that I do, because that'll be relevant when we get into the evidence for Matthean priority, because some of the evidence that I give is actually going to demand that Luke is the second gospel written. It's not going to be a simple case of you can explain this by saying Matthew's first and Mark is second. Some of the arguments I give, you're going to have a Matthew, Luke, Mark. So I will get into some of the cases for that momentarily. The main motivation for the Augustinian hypothesis is from the Church Fathers, because uh, at least on a surface level reading of them, it looks like, they all just say it was Matthew, Luke, Mark, right? Or rather, they say it's Matthew, Mark, Luke. So that's why you have it that way in the New Testament, and so it's kind of that. I think that is the main argument for it. There's not really like an independent literary reason to prefer that hypothesis. It's pretty much just pulling from the testimony of the early church. And I think that was the dominant view, was that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke. I mean, going back probably almost to like the beginning of modern biblical studies, just because that was sort of the inherited view from, our canonical order of the Gospels in the Bible. Uh, J.J. Griesbach, who, my hypothesis takes its name from, he began challenging this. I really should know the dates better. I think he's like more like mid 19th century. So it's earlier than the Markan priority stuff, but that's sort of when my view starts becoming a major player in the ideas. Now, as I will argue in a bit when we get to the evidence for when we start talking about the external evidence, I'm going to argue that my view is earlier, and it's supported in the Church Fathers, actually better than the Augustinian hypothesis is. But so I am trying to be respectful to the Church Fathers and give them their say. But yeah, that would be I think when my view starts coming on the scene historically.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was actually going to ask. So you already answered that. I was going to say, if the Augustinian view is just appealing to the Church Fathers, then wouldn't that kind of bear more weight, like you were just saying you were looking for with these arguments? But I guess you're going to deal with that a little further. So I'll let you kind of take us down this rabbit hole at your you guide this, because you know where you're going.
All right, yeah, we'll get to the difference between Augustinian and two gospel hypotheses, but those are the two main Matthean priority positions versus the two more. Now there are other ones like there's a Lukean priority view out there, and there's now a whole bunch of, well, not a whole, there's like a minority movement that wants to still retain Markan priority, but like switch Luke to being the second one and say Matthew's actually last. So you do have like a whole bunch of other theories out there. These are like the four major ones, the four sort of historically prominent ones. So those are kind of why I'm focusing on those. But yeah, so let's begin with like Markan priority, right? Because this is like the cornerstone of most synoptic theories out there. It's like taken to be so certain, like it's just assumed in the vast majority of stuff on New Testament scholarship, like even by evangelicals. And I think it's just worth asking, like, why, right? Like, why are we so confident that the Gospel of Mark is first? So let's let them make their case, right? Earlier, I mentioned a guy by the name of B.H. Streeter, and you had asked, right, why like what was his reasoning that made Markan priority so popular? And it's kind of interesting because there's a fun little history lesson here, which by the way is one reason why when people say to me like, well, like almost all biblical scholars disagree with you on something, my answer is I don't care. This story is one of the main reasons why I just don't think that like biblical scholars are very good at logical reasoning, so the fact that they all agree on something does not move me at all. And this is because B.H. Streeter, one of probably his like was his most influential. I think he gave like four or five different arguments for Markan priority, but his most influential one was called the argument from order. And basically, you can kind of divvy up the stories in the Gospels by what scholars call pericopes. And so when you look at the sort of order in them, if you look at Matthew and in Luke, uh, allegedly, when you look at their stories, it kind of be like, oh, well, it looks like they're like following Mark's order in their stories, right? Except for when they don't. So there's these things called they're called I think it's called the minor agreements. Yeah, the minor agreements between Matthew and Luke, where Matthew and Luke's order actually agrees and it's not with Mark. But that is the exception. In general, you can see that basic trajectory. And so Streeter's argument was like, well, look, this makes complete sense, right? If Matthew and Luke are using Mark, then of course, like they're going to be following his order. So uh, that means Mark is the first gospel written. The problem here is that you're using the assumption of the theory as the evidence for the theory. It works just as well the other way around. You can say that instead that Mark is following Matthew's order, or he's following Luke's order, or you can say Luke is doing that. Like literally for any of them, you can explain the order this way. So this is kind of what's been called the Lachman fallacy, and it was brilliantly exposed back in 1952 by a British scholar by the name of B.C. Butler. And I'm just going to read his quote because I don't think I can ever say it better than he did. So here is what he wrote back in 1952. And remember, this is when like Markan priority had become the dominant position, basically on the basis of this argument. What he wrote in his book, The Originality of St. Matthew, he said, quote, on the basis of this accurate statement of highly important data, Streeter, following in the wake of a distinguished line of critics, and himself not the last in the ranks, rests an inference which is obviously false. Since the argument conceals a schoolboyish error, whoops, I missed my. Okay, since the argument conceals a schoolboyish error of elementary reasoning at the very base of the two document hypothesis, as commonly proposed for our acceptance, we may be forgiven for devoting to its refutation more space than it intrinsically deserves. The deduction to be drawn from these facts is no longer that Mark contains the whole of a document which Matthew and Luke have independently used, but that there is a relation of dependence, one way or the other, between Matthew and Mark, and again between Mark and Luke. Is it too much to hope that the Lachman fallacy will no longer be displayed with every appearance of superior logic before the imagination of an unsuspecting public prone to submit to the claim to reason and slow to examine its validity? The cantina of authors listed above as propagating this fallacy should at least suggest a doubt whether the present dominance of the theory of Markan priority is really due, as is commonly supposed, to a triumph of honest criticism over traditionalism and fantasy. So, that was a long worded way of basically saying the argument is completely reversible. And this is now like widely acknowledged. Uh, Contemporary proponents of Markan priority, people like Mark Goodacre, they acknowledge that, oh yeah, this was a bad argument. It can be completely turned around. It makes sense either way. The problem is it duped like every biblical scholar for like 50 years till Butler came along and was like, guys, you can just flip this around and it works the other way. And so, like, now they've admitted it, but that was 50 years of this fallacy convincing people of Markan priority. And so people wonder why, like, I'm not impressed to say that all biblical scholars agree on something. It's because of examples like this. It's just they're not good at logical reasoning sometimes. So that's why that argument is the main reason why Markan priority became so entrenched. And it's obviously fallacious, like, obviously.
What's funny is you have this issue of, I mean, what you're describing is just an appeal to the majority or appeal to consensus, which is a logical fallacy in and of itself. But other than that, I mean, one of the problems with that is the consensus continues to grow as it's appealed to itself. So you have these people that posit this argument, and then as other people commit to it and jump on it, then they use that consensus to defend it. And so you have this group over here, and this person's like, oh, well, the consensus believes that and joins them, and now they've made the consensus bigger, but there's no actual, it's a house of cards.
Yep. Yes, and they're not all fields are like this, right? Because some fields encourage critical thinking, like others don't. So, like in philosophy, for example, if you come up with something like new that nobody's ever come up with before, and it's like this crazy radical thesis, philosophy is going to encourage that and be like, "Oh, like this is so interesting. Let's look into it." biblical studies does not have that sort of appreciation for a new radical thesis. Like they really value consensus there. So like, but I mean, in some cases, it just ends up being a bunch of guys, getting high on the smell of each other's own farts. I mean, it's just a big social club at times. And there is not the encouragement for that. So students who are in a class in biblical studies, it's like they'd be very pressured. Like, well, you may have been raised with these beliefs about the Bible, but like we have to put that aside and be critical. And like everything is couched that way. So like you're conditioning people that like there's like without actually giving them any good reasons for believing things like Markan priority. It's just this is the assured result of biblical criticism. You don't want to be one of those fundamentalists, right? You want to be like honest and objective and like this is what we scholars just know to be true. There's a lot of that goes on in biblical studies. And if I could speak, it's a systemic problem in the field of New Testament. Is this over reliance, this overvaluing of basically nose counting experts?
Hmm. So there's more than in certain groups. There's kind of this almost like a Christianity wide problem of, well, this is what we believe, this is what we've already determined, and so we're just going to leave it alone. And this confirmation bias that tends to take place, and this pushing down of anybody who wants to question or challenge it. So it's not really isolated to necessarily to individual groups, but it seems to be kind of a church-wide problem in a sense. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's biblical studies. People are very conditioned to sort of reinforce these sort of long-standing pillars, if you will, of biblical studies. And it's not to say that they're like, it's not to say that like debate over this stuff isn't allowed, right? But it's to say that it's not really encouraged. They don't encourage people to, uh, go up against the consensus of scholars. And you will see this like way more in biblical studies than you will in I mean, I can't speak for every field, but in other fields that I'm interested in, predominantly is going to be philosophy. There is not this sort of value placed on scholarly consensus the way that there is in biblical studies.
Isn't that though? If I could push back a little bit, isn't that also though a form of protection to prevent people from going way off the rails? Because, like for example, I just had Tim Berg on the other day to talk about the importance of studying church history. And even what you're appealing to in your argument is this is what the early church fathers all agreed on. And so, in some ways, consulting those creeds and those councils, it allows us to see kind of safeguards and fences that have been put up to prevent people from going way off the rails in their thinking and into heresy. So, is it a similar situation in Christian apologetics, or is it a different problem? And is there some sort of balance that we're supposed to strike to prevent from? I mean, I could understand wanting to kind of safeguard certain things so that you're not just encouraging people to come up with all these different wacky ideas that then can lead anywhere.
Yeah, I think the emphasis should be on basically critical thinking. So on basically following the evidence where it leads. Uh, it's a little bit different, I think, when we're dealing with matters of say like doctrine, right? So if we're trying to establish what is the Christian faith, it's very good to have clear boundaries there, and I think church history is absolutely important for distinguishing that. I don't think what we're saying to people though is like you shouldn't like you need like you should be afraid to question things that are outside of that guardrail, right? Like don't go outside of that guardrail, right? Like don't look at the man behind the curtain there. I don't think that's the perspective that we would want to have on sort of the definition of orthodoxy. We want to have clear boundaries just so we can determine like what it is, so that Christianity is not this nebulous sort of anyone's a Christian who thinks so. It would be more a case of we just want it to be clearly demarcated who's in and who's out. I wouldn't encourage somebody to well, don't look into these things that could potentially falsify Christianity. No, look into those things. I'm confident that you're going to come out of the. In fact, I'm confident that if you like are really critical with it, then like it's just going to reinforce your Christian faith. Your Christian faith should come out of it even stronger at the end. But yeah, I mean, I certainly would not use the guardrails of orthodoxy to like as a reason to say that people should not question things that are outside of there. That would be my answer. All right, so moving on. So the argument from order is not particularly good. Another kind of once popular argument for Markan priority comes from the presence of what's called Semitisms or Hebraisms in the Gospel of Mark. So allegedly, when Semitisms or Hebraisms, these are basically like distinctive Hebrew words. Remember, the Gospels are written in Greek, but sometimes they're these distinctively Hebrew terms that term up in there. And so, allegedly, the argument says, well, Mark has way more of these than Matthew and Luke do. And so this means that Mark has to be the earliest one. Uh, the reasoning here is that the idea is supposed to be that if it's got more Hebrew stuff in it, well, Jesus was Hebrew, so this is probably closer to what Jesus actually said. So, if it's got more of that, then it's going to be closer to what Jesus said, which basically means it's earlier. That's the basic reasoning underlying the argument. So there's two problems with it. There's a conceptual problem and an empirical problem. The conceptual problem is first that we just know that Matthew has the most Hebrew audience of like any of the gospel writers. So like
How do we know that?
it's going to just be based on the sort of emphases that he has. So, like, Matthew's always saying, like, Jesus did this to fulfill this prophecy. So he's very interested in, like, proving that Jesus is the Messiah. Matthew doesn't feel the need to explain, like, Hebrew rituals and things to the degree that, like, Luke and Mark do. So he seems to assume his audience is just going to know a lot of the distinctively Jewish stuff. So it's pretty well agreed upon that Matthew has a is like the most Jewish of the Gospels. And so like we know that the Gospel authors have different audiences, and so they can tailor like how much Hebrew stuff they want to like write to their audiences within their Gospels. So it's just because one gospel decides to include more, Semitisms, that doesn't automatically mean it's closer to the time of Jesus. There's just no reason to assume that there's a correlation between those things. So basically, the argument's conceptually flawed. Empirically, it's just not the case that Mark has the most Semitisms of any of the Gospels. Matthew has the highest number of them, which makes sense because he's got the most Jewish interests. Luke has the second most, and Mark has the fewest. And I mean, to some extent, it depends on how you count them, right? But by just about any objective measure, Mark does not come up having the most Semitisms anyway. So even if the conceptual problem were not a problem, which it is, empirically, it's simply not true that Mark has the most Semitisms in it. So that's not a very good argument for Markan priority. Sorry, do you have a question on that before I moved on?
Yeah, so I'm curious along those lines, the Semitisms and things like that in Matthew. What do you think of this idea that Matthew also wrote a Hebrew version of his gospel? Where did this come from, and what do you think of it? I'm curious.
Yeah, I'll get into this in a little bit more
Okay.
detail when we talk about the external evidence. I myself don't think that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, and I'll kind of get into my reasons for why. It comes from certain statements, some that we've already discussed, in the church fathers, where some of them seem to say that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew originally. And so if believe that, if you think that that's the correct way to understand what they're saying, then yeah, I could see why you would think Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew. And also the argument saying that like our Gospel of Matthew, it's not possible that there could have been a Hebrew original. They're garbage. Like there's no reason there couldn't have been. As it happens, I just don't think that that is the best way to read Papias and Irenaeus, who are going to be our two earliest witnesses. I think there's actually a better way to understand them where they're not saying that it was written in Hebrew. And so what I think is that you had a misunderstanding take place. I think Origen got this confused with the gospel to the Hebrews, which was written in Hebrew. And so Origen started basically the mythos that there was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew based on his confusing the Gospel of Matthew with the Gospel of the Hebrews, and probably also misunderstanding Papias and Irenaeus. I'll get into details on that when we get to the external stuff. Just real quick, let me move through the rest of these arguments from Markan priority. And this is a bit of a newer one, but it's the argument from Christology. So we've kind of mentioned it before. It's that Mark supposedly has the lowest Christology of all the synoptics. And so you can supposedly see Matthew and Luke improving Luke's Christology. And so what this implies is that Luke is the first gospel written. And then as Christology evolves and gets higher and people start thinking of Jesus as God, then you start having gospel writers sort of try to fix things in Mark and make Jesus look more divine. That's the running idea behind it. So there are a few issues with it. Well, I would say, yeah, it basically hinges on two dubious assumptions. So first, it's assuming that belief in Jesus's divinity evolved over time, right? And it assumes that high Christology isn't present from the very inception of Christianity. That's a problem because we have Paul, who, I mean, by just about everyone's lights, the Apostle Paul is writing earlier than the Gospel of Mark, and the Apostle Paul very clearly believes that Jesus is God. Richard Bauckham kind of famously said the earliest Christology was already the highest Christology, right? Just about no one's going to dispute that Paul is earlier than Mark. Paul already has Jesus as God. So we don't actually have any reason to think that high Christology is something that developed later on. And the whole argument really tends to assume that. So kind of if you reject that assumption, the argument doesn't work. But even if you accept that, right? Like, let's just say for the sake of argument that it did develop later on, we can just debate that Mark has a low Christology, right? I'm very confident that they're cherry picking their examples on this, right? So they like to use a certain passage in Mark 6:5-6, where it says that Jesus could not do any miracles in a particular town because of their lack of faith. Whereas, if you read it in Matthew, it says that he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. And so they say, aha, look, we've got this inability on Jesus's part in Mark. And Matthew fixes that, right? Matthew makes it look a little bit better. It just says he didn't do it, not that he couldn't do it. So in the first place, just considering Mark's gospel as a whole, you've got this theme that Jesus only responds in response to people's faith, right? We have it right. And I think it's chapter 1 or 2 is the healing of the paralytic. And Jesus asks him, like, if he believes, and that's like the condition for him healing him. And another thing about that passage that's interesting too is that it highlights actually Jesus's divinity, because you've got everybody around there saying, like, does he have the ability to forgive sins? And it's a bit scandalous that Jesus thinks that he can forgive sins because only God can forgive sins. So we actually have an implicit affirmation of Jesus's divinity in that story. But more importantly, what it teaches us is that one of Mark's themes is that Jesus only heals people if they have faith. So when it's saying that he could not heal many people there because of their lack of faith, it's not saying that he lacks the ability, as though people's faith gave Jesus the ability to heal them. It's saying that given his stance on this, given that he's only going to heal people in response to their faith, he can't consistently with that stance heal the people in this town because of their unbelief. That seems to me to clearly be what Mark means, and that's just based on other stuff in the Gospel of Mark. I don't have to even presuppose my Christian beliefs in Jesus's divinity to get there. I say it's a cherry-picked example because you could make the exact same argument the other way, right? If we go to Jesus's trial, right, when he's before Pilate in both Mark and Matthew, Pilate asks him, right, are you the Son of God, right? Well, in Mark, we get this very straightforward, I am. In Matthew, we get this very cryptic, like, you say that I am. Like, if I was going to argue this the other way, if I was assuming that like high Christology was something that came later, I could pounce on that, right? Like, if this was the other way around, if this was the other way around, that they would be jumping on this and be like, well, look, in Mark, it's not too sure, right? He says, well, you say that I am, but like Matthew fixes that, right? He has him say, I am. So there's no doubt about it. The problem, of course, is that it's the other way around. So what you actually have in all the gospels is this sort of, mixture, and you can cherry pick examples to sort of make it look however you want. So yeah, that's kind of why I don't buy arguments from low Christology for Markan priority. And sorry, did you have a comment on that one?
No, you're good.
All right, so this next argument is a fun one. It's the argument from Mark's mistakes and from Matthew's mistakes. And so basically, what they argue is that anytime there's something that's supposedly a mistake in Mark, uh, and it doesn't turn up in Matthew, then they'll say that basically Matthew is fixing Mark's mistake. But then when it's the other way around, when supposedly Matthew has a mistake and Mark doesn't, then they're like, well, that just proves that like Mark is closer to the events because look, he got it right and Matthew didn't. And so the problem there is it's unfalsifiable. When Mark gets it right, that proves Markan priority. When Mark gets it wrong, that proves Markan priority. Like, which is it? Ward Powers in his book on this has a funny quote on that. He says, quote, to consider the implications of these last two arguments, when Mark is wrong and Matthew and Luke do not contain the mistake, this proves Markan priority. But when Matthew or Luke is wrong and Mark does not contain the mistake, this proves Markan priority. When Matthew has a better structure and context than Matthew or Luke, this proves Markan priority. And when Matthew or Luke has a better structure or context than Mark, this proves Markan priority. What sort of an argument is that? So he's basically making fun of the Markan priorists there. It's like it's a heads I win, tails you lose situation. Like no matter how the evidence turns up, it always just has to indicate Markan priority. So a lot of that turns up. So those are sort of like the classic arguments for Markan priority. They don't turn up as much anymore in like modern scholarship because my position kind of came to it sort of had like a rebirth in sort of the later 20th century, and so the proponents of it started really hammering home these problems with the arguments for Markan priority, and so they don't turn up as much anymore. So in the 21st century, we had this scholar by the name of Mark Goodacre come along. Now, he doesn't believe in the two-source hypothesis. He doesn't believe that there was a Q document, but he does very strongly believe in Markan priority. And so he has kind of saved Markan priority in the opinion of a lot of Markan priorists because he came up with new arguments to show that Mark is first since, all of the old ones had so many holes in them. And so he kind of has two arguments that he uses. So these would be the arguments from Additions and Omissions, and then the argument from Editorial Fatigue. So basically, the argument from Additions and Omissions says, like, look, there's a whole bunch of, stuff in Mark that's kind of weird, and it doesn't turn up in Matthew and Luke, right? And so it seems like that's stuff that they would have wanted to leave out. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff in Matthew and Luke where, if Mark was using them, I mean, how can we seriously believe that, like, he wouldn't have the Sermon on the Mount, right? Clearly, if Mark knew about this stuff in Matthew and Luke, he would have used it, right? My issue with this argument is that it assumes that Mark is including everything that he knows about, that he wants to include everything that he knows about. And, like, we just know that that's not true. In the first place on the basis of the end of his own gospel. He says that there's going to be appearance, at least if we accept the short ending of Mark, he says that there's going to be appearances of Jesus, but he never tells us about them. So it's clear he's not trying to include absolutely everything that he knows in his gospel. And so that's kind of a gratuitous assumption. Furthermore, in his book, Powers argues that there's kind of a different target audience for Mark. So he argues that Matthew, and Luke are what he calls Christian didache. So this is didactic text for believers, whereas Mark, he argues, is early Christian kerygma, which is like preaching material for unbelievers. So basically, Matthew and Luke rather, are for Christians. Mark is for non-Christians, basically for conversion. If that's the case, then it's not really surprising that there's a whole lot of stuff that Mark isn't going to include that's going to be of more interest to Christians. So broadly, that's how I answer that argument.
So
And then
you do agree with that?
what?
With that statement, you do or don't agree that Mark is more
Preaching material?
preaching material than Matthew, Luke are Didache?
I do agree with that. I
You
think
do,
that
okay.
that's plausible. It's not required to rebut the argument. I think you can rebut the argument just by showing that Mark knows about stuff that he doesn't include in his own narrative. But independently of that, I think that there's just good reasons to think that it's a kerygma rather than a didactic text, and so it's not intended for Christians primarily. It's primarily for non-believers, and so that's why a lot of the material is just left out.
Then what do you do with, like, in Matthew, the way that we talk about how Matthew being kind of Jew-centric, where he seems to be kind of focusing his thing on the fulfillment of prophecy and all that, that he's trying to show the Jews that this is the fulfillment of the Messiah that you've been waiting for. Wouldn't that be evangelistic in some sense?
Yeah, all of the gospels have, apologetic, evangelistic things in there, but these materials don't have to be interpreted as being for unbelievers in particular. They can just as easily be understood as being for believers to unbelievers. So, like, you can have apologetic books even today that are written for Christians, right, to equip Christians. So, based on broader things
Okay, gotcha.
based on broader things in Matthew's narrative, there's reasons. I mean, it's almost, not that I want to appeal to consensus, but it's almost universally agreed upon that it's Jewish Jews, Jewish Christians that are the target audience of Matthew's narrative. So for independent reasons, I think he has a Christian audience. But yes, he does include this apologetic material in there sort of for their own, for them to know it. So that when they're dealing with Jewish people in their community, they'll be able to say, like, look, Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfills these sorts of prophecies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. I did not know that.
Okay. Last argument is from Editorial Fatigue. This is probably the favorite modern argument for Markan priority. The argument from Editorial Fatigue says basically that there's these continuity errors that turn up in Matthew and in Luke. So you've got like a story that they share with Mark, but in Mark's narrative, it's perfectly consistent. Whereas in, Matthew and Luke's narrative, it's like they started copying from Mark, and then they sort of changed something early on in the story. They decided to make a change, and then they went back to copying Mark and copied in something that sort of made the story inconsistent. And so that shows us that they're depending on Mark, basically because the story is consistent in Mark, but it's not consistent in Matthew and Luke. Did you want an example?
Yeah, go ahead and give an example of that.
Okay, so one of Goodacre's favorite examples comes from Mark 144, right? So in Mark 144, Jesus heals a leper, and then he says to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but then go show yourself to the priest, right? Well, in Matthew's version of that story, which is in Matthew 8, 1 through 4, prior to the healing of the leper, Matthew has Jesus coming down from a mountain, and it says that large crowds followed him. So according to Goodacre, this makes Matthew's narrative incoherent, right? He tells the leper not to tell anyone, but he healed him in front of a crowd, right? So why is he telling him not to tell anyone if he healed him in front of a crowd? That makes Matthew's narrative kind of contradictory. And so probably what happened is he added in that crowds were happening, and then he started copying from Mark and forgot that he put the detail in there about the crowds, and so he made his own narrative internally inconsistent. That's the idea. It's a sort of inconsistency which is supposed to sort of betray his hand that he's depending on Mark.
Is there any actual evidence for these kind of things? Because it sounds highly speculative.
It is, yeah. These are very silly arguments for the most part. So, first thing to point out is that you don't actually have to take Matthew 8:1 as the sort of beginning of the story of the healing of the leper. You could actually end the chapter. So you could end chapter 7 basically with verse 1 of chapter 8 and then begin chapter 8 with verse 2 as its own story. And so you actually don't even have to say that the crowd is there, right? Like this could just be like the end of the story is that Jesus walked off the mountain and the crowds followed him, unspoken time jump, and we hop to the healing of the leper. There's no crowd there. So if you actually think that there's an inconsistency in Jesus telling the leper to, not tell anyone, even though we just healed him in front of a crowd, you can just say that the pericope ends there and that the crowd isn't there for the healing of the leper. Another thing you could do is to just say that there's absolutely nothing inconsistent about Jesus healing in front of a crowd and then telling him not to say anything to anyone. In fact, we have an example of Jesus doing this in the Gospel of Mark.
Just terrible whenever you use their arguments against them.
This is why I'm not a Markan priorist. Okay. So in Mark 7:32 through 37, we have a very similar story where Jesus heals a deaf and mute man in front of a multitude and then tells the entire multitude not to tell anyone what he had done. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like the gospel authors think that there's anything terribly inconsistent about Jesus healing in front of a crowd and then saying, don't tell anyone. We literally have an example of it in the Gospel of Mark. Like, there's no question about uh, the fact that that's what's happening in Mark chapter 7. So, yeah, Goodacre gives other examples of this, right? He thinks that you have this with like John the Baptist, for example. Uh, I've dealt with the nitty gritties of this in a video on my own channel called A Critique of Markan Priority. So if someone wants to see me go through all of the examples of this and why I don't think that they're actually um, contradictory, I don't think that there's actually continuity errors there. But I mean, there's actually a further problem with this argument too, and it's that even if you think that there are inconsistencies there, right? Like, let's say that you don't believe in harmonizing the Bible, okay? You can flip this argument around too. You can say that the error was original, basically, to Matthew or Luke's narrative, and then just say that Mark saw it when he was copying from them and that he fixed it and made it consistent. I mean, that's just as good of an explanation as saying that, Matthew was, such a lame brain that he made a change to Mark and forgot he did it 2 sentences later. I mean, that works too. So, yeah, that's kind of my big issues with that argument. I don't think that you actually have these examples of continuity errors, but even if you do, you could explain them just as well the other way around. So
I'm seeing a pattern with a lot of these arguments for Markan priority. It seems that the sword they use cuts both ways.
they're reversible. Yes, reversibility is a big issue here because a lot
What
of
isn't there a logical fallacy by that name?
well, I mean, the fallacy that it's come to be known as is is called the Lachman fallacy, but I don't. That's more of a term in biblical studies.
I guess it's just called a double-edged argument. I was just looking it up. Um, where a logical or where the logic of an argument could equally apply to both sides, weakening the persuasive value.
Yeah, they're called reversible arguments, typically, like in the literature on the synoptic problem. But it wouldn't surprise me in logic they would have a different term for it.
Okay. So then what's next?
Well, so if we say that like the arguments for Markan priority are garbage, to put it nicely, then we can probably pretty safely say, okay, then we don't really have any business being at nearly as confident as most biblical scholars are that Markan priority is actually true.
Now, are
It's,
these? Did you just cover all of the main arguments? Are there any other better arguments than what you've just given?
those are the main ones. The last two I covered are the two like that were supposed to save the day after the previous ones I talked about collapse. These were the two that were like the 21st century's attempt to have a comeback.
Hmm. Okay, so then I want to come back to something. Maybe you addressed it, but maybe I missed it. But with the guy who invented this theory about this Q document, um, what was his reason for coming up with this idea of this extra document? It seems highly speculative. There's no sort of evidence that we have that that's a thing, and it's very late in history that he's come up with this. So
Yeah.
why and where did he get this idea?
So the idea is if we assume Mark is the first gospel written, then Matthew and Luke, the stuff that they share in common with Mark, they can get that from Mark. But you also have a whole bunch of stuff in Matthew and Luke that's shared together that's not in Mark. How do you account for that? Now, if you go with the Farrer Golder view, then it's just going to be easy. Luke got it from Matthew, right? But Streeter and other proponents of the two source hypothesis, they basically think that there's a good argument that Luke doesn't know the Gospel of Matthew. The argument's incredibly weak. The argument is that, well, Luke just, it's so different from Matthew, you know? And so that's supposed to mean that he didn't know it. Yeah. That's another reason why the two source hypothesis is kind of dying and being replaced by the Farrer hypothesis. But supposedly, yeah, the supposedly is you have to account for the common material between those two. And supposedly there's a good argument that Luke doesn't know the Gospel of Matthew, so that being the case, if they don't know each other but they have common material, then they have to be drawing from a common source, and we call that Q. That's basically the reason for thinking that it exists. Is it's supposed to explain the common material in Matthew and Luke on the assumption that they don't know each other.
Okay, so this idea of this Q document is to refer back to our last session together. It's entirely ad hoc. He's just
Yeah.
created this idea in order to support the conclusion that he wants to have, which is Mark came first.
Well, so you don't actually have to do that because you could go the Farrer Golder route, which does say Mark is first, but doesn't believe in Q. So you can go Mark, Matthew, Luke.
Right. I mean, this guy that created the Q document thing, it was basically he just concocted it in order to defend his position at that time. Farrer Golder came later, right?
Yeah,
Shortly after.
Farrer Golder comes much later.
Okay.
Two source hypothesis. Yeah, it was supposed to be based on convincing reasons that Luke doesn't know Matthew, but they have common material. But I mean, I think that plank that Luke doesn't know Matthew is very, very weak.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So then let's get into
The case for the priority of
yes.
Matthew. So I split it into two legs. That's going to be the external evidence and the internal evidence. We can start with the external evidence. It's unfortunately not discussed that much in contemporary like synoptic studies, and it's surprising because they say a lot about the order of the Gospels to one another, the early church, and like historically they would be best positioned to know, and unfortunately it's just almost dismissed out of the gate as unreliable. In fact, I got a fun quotation here from Martin Moss. He's a conservative scholar, but this is what he has to say about basically the current state of modern synoptic research. He says, quote, there appears to be a consensus that if conclusions reached from source criticism conflict with the witness of the early church, then the latter can be dismissed with the lamest explanations or sometimes without any explanation at all. Papias thus becomes the primary whipping boy when the early church fathers' belief that Matthew wrote first is thought to conflict with the generally accepted priority of Mark. Mark Goodacre, evidently embarrassed by this conflict, is more horrifyingly forthright than most, saying, it will be most prudent to continue to treat the patristic witness with a pinch of salt. I doubt, however, whether the optimal approach to any historical problem is to jettison all the available ancient evidence at the outset. Discrediting the early fathers simply raises the unanswered, and indeed usually unasked question, how did they all come to be so wrong? So I agree with Moss there. I don't think we should begin our investigation by jettisoning what all of our historical sources have to say about it. In what world is that a good idea? Unfortunately, that is just like that's assumed in most contemporary synoptic research is that you don't have to worry about what the early church had to say about the matter. What do they know? But if we instead decide let's put the prior we've already taken care of the priority of Mark, right? Arguments are not good for it. So maybe we give the early church a second chance, right? Let's see what they have to say without any internal considerations of the gospels themselves. We'll get there, but I just want to see what's the picture we get if we sort of look at what the early church had to say, right? So our earliest witness is going to be this guy named Papias of Hierapolis. He tells us that Matthew and Mark wrote their, well, he uncontroversially tells us that Matthew and Mark wrote their gospels. He doesn't really say anything about the order of one to the other, though. I think we actually have a larger fragment from him that does say that Matthew is the first gospel to have been written, but that's controversial, so I won't get into that here. So, as I mentioned before, Irenaeus is our earliest witness who uncontroversially mentions all four of the Gospels.
And to give people an idea, Papias was around 140 AD, and then Irenaeus was even before that, around 120 AD.
Irenaeus is typically put around like 170.
Really interesting. Okay.
Papias, I would date him to the
Or
90s to
okay,
100.
maybe that's the writing. I'm talking about. Sorry, that's when he was born. I was looking at the wrong date. So he's estimated to be born around 120 to 140 AD. So then that means his main writings would
Yes.
have been around what you're saying, 170, and then Papias would have been around when?
Well, so he's a little actually when to date him is controversial. I put him in the
Okay.
90s to early 100s. Yeah, you can't go much later than 140 with Papias, but
Okay.
I
Cool.
think he's much, much earlier than that.
Okay.
But
Interesting.
yeah, that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, Irenaeus is our first uncontroversial witness to all four Gospels. He's very clear that Matthew is first and that John is last. I read the quotation from him before. He mentions Mark second, but he doesn't actually have like any sequential statement in there that actually says Mark has to be second. So he does mention Mark second, and then he mentions Luke. But yeah, the statement by him, he's very clear Matthew is first and John is last. He's a little ambiguous about if Mark or Luke is second or third. Next, we have Clement of Alexandria, also writing towards the end of the second century. He's very clear that the Gospels with the genealogies, he says, are the earliest to be written. So, which Gospels have the genealogies? Matthew and Luke. So, he's very clear Matthew and Luke are the first Gospels to be written. And so, he thinks that Mark is third. So, we begin to see a pattern emerging, right? Everybody's saying Mark or Matthew's first. We have some ambiguity about the relationship between Mark to Luke. Now we have a clear statement that Luke is second and that Mark is third. Go a little bit later into church history, and we get to Origen. Now, Origen is very clear that Matthew's the first gospel written. He also seems pretty clear that Mark is the second gospel written, and then he thinks Luke is third. There's a little bit of ambiguity there. There's a little bit of wiggle room, and some people who take my perspective will try to exploit that and say, well, he's not clear either. I'm inclined to say probably Origen did think that the Gospel of Mark was the second gospel to have been written and that Luke was third. We get to Augustine a little bit later. Augustine, of course, from whom the Augustinian hypothesis takes its name. He says that you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He says he even labels them as first, second, third, and last. So that's why the Augustinian hypothesis gets its name from him. Now, I actually think Augustine changed his mind on this later on. We probably don't have the space to go into the details here, but I think in some of his later writings, he actually changes his mind on this and does come to think that Mark is the third of the synoptics to have been written. Really interesting paper by David Peabody that defends that hypothesis. And on the video that I did on the external evidence for the priority of Matthew, I do get into this a little bit about why I think Augustine actually changed his mind on this issue. But so the order that we get is everybody is unanimous that Gospel of Matthew is written first. They're all unanimous that the Gospel of John is written last. We have some potential disagreements about the relationship between Mark and Luke. Uh, Clement is doesn't really leave any question that he thinks Luke is second. Origen, I think most probably thinks that Luke is third, right? So I think we probably do have a genuine disagreement with those two sources. What do we do with that? I say all of the things being equal, let's prefer what the older source says. And the older source in this case is Clement. So if we go with that, we get Matthew, Luke, Mark. And so that's the two gospel or Griesbach hypothesis that I hold to. So that's kind of the primary case from the external evidence for the priority of Matthew.
Okay.
I start. What's that?
So what do you do with when did we get the kind of classical order that we currently have in our New Testament, where it's why or is it listed the way that it is? Was it from a historical like opinion that these are the order that they were written in, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or was it just kind of random and put together that way?
Yeah, this is really interesting because you actually have multiple canonical orders in the like older editions of the Bible. You always have Matthew first, and you always have John last. Most of the time, you do have Mark, so it usually is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, like you have in your Bible. But some old copies have Matthew, Luke, Mark, John in there. So that's actually David Black goes over this actually in his book, Why Four Gospels. So we actually had two different canonical orders of the Gospels. Again, because most like compilations of the New Testament, it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That's why your Bible today is going to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, because that was the most numerous one. But we do actually have examples where Luke is listed second in some of the canonical orders, which again is suggestive that there was some opinion in the early church that Luke was the second gospel to have been written.
And so when was that? I don't know if you mentioned it. When was that order kind of solidified as kind of just accepted, the
That's
accepted
a good
order?
question. I would guess it's probably when they started like printing Bibles. So probably around like the time of like 15, 1600s when you have Gutenberg come out with the printing press and they started printing Bibles. And so things got a lot more standardized than they had been in like handwritten Bibles before that point. Before then, people probably just kind of followed whatever order was in the manuscript they were copying. So I don't know for sure, but my guess would be that our like established canonical order, I would imagine that becomes solidified around the time of the printing press, so Reformation era.
Interesting. Okay.
All right, so yeah, I do want to address the question of if Matthew is written in Hebrew because you brought it up. Um, the sources that say this are going to be Papias seems to say this, Irenaeus seems to say this, Origen definitely says this, and Augustine probably says this. So that middle point, right, with Clement of Alexandria, he doesn't make any specific language about the he doesn't say anything about the language of the gospel. So our two earliest witnesses, Papias is the earliest one, and what's interesting is the Greek word he uses there. He says that Matthew is written in a Hebrew dialecto, is the word there. It's where we get our word dialect. Now, that can translate to language. So it could be Hebrew language, it could be Hebrew dialect, it could be Hebrew style, right? These are all legitimate translations of the word. When you look at the prior context from Papias, uh, it looks like he's interested in the style of Matthew and Mark. He's like talking about their orders. He's saying that like Mark didn't write everything he didn't write everything in order, but he was careful. He's not getting it wrong. He didn't write it. So he looks like he's interested in the styles. And so if we let context determine things, it's probable then that Papias is saying that Matthew is written not in the Hebrew language, but that it's written in a Hebrew style. which would mean something like for a Hebrew audience, which we've already discussed the evidence for that within our Greek Matthew. If that's correct, then we don't actually have to say that this was written in Hebrew originally. And another interesting piece of evidence for that is that Papias doesn't have a definite article there. So he doesn't say like the Hebrew dialecto, right? Like if he meant language there, we would expect him to say that Matthew wrote this in the Hebrew language, right? But because it doesn't have the word the there, it's just he wrote this Hebrew dialecto, right? So because he doesn't have the definite article, that can lend some credibility to that he might actually mean that this is written in a Hebrew style, not in the Hebrew language. Similar story with Irenaeus, who's our second oldest one, also says something about a relationship between Matthew and the Hebrew. He's also ambiguous. It doesn't have to be interpreted as Hebrew language. It can also just as easily be interpreted as Hebrew style, Hebrew dialect, something like that. So our two oldest witnesses on this are ambiguous. We have no textual evidence for a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Like it doesn't exist, and that's kind of weird because like the church was crazy good about preserving the Bible. Let's say like the New Testament is amazingly well attested in the manuscript tradition, and we have nothing. We don't have even a fragment of this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Kind of strange if that's what they're saying. So what I think happened is that Origen is our first person who clearly says that Matthew is written in a Hebrew language. He's writing much later. He's, I think, like writing in the 4th century. And he probably had read Papias. Well, we know he'd read Papias and Irenaeus. He probably misunderstood them to be talking about the Hebrew language. He knew about the gospel to the Hebrews, which was a gospel written in Hebrew, and he probably confused the two. That's my theory for how this idea of a Hebrew Matthew came about. You don't have to agree with me on that, but that's my idea for kind of how the legend got started. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good explanation.
Okay. So last thing to deal with here would just be how do well, again, Markan priorists almost never deal with the external evidence at all and think they can just dismiss it out of hand. Mark Goodacre gives kind of a half-hearted attempt in one of his books. Guess what his explanation is going to be for why the church says that Matthew is the author of the first gospel?
I don't even know.
Okay. Well, his story is, well, Matthew was the gospel that was written by an apostle, right? Mark and Luke, these aren't apostles, but Matthew was. So the early church, they all believed in traditional authorship. So of course they had to have just thought that the oldest one would have been written by an apostle. Um, First problem with that is that you don't have this sort of reasoning going on in any of the church fathers. You don't have them like trying to figure out the order that the gospels are written in. They're just reporting this as either tradition or something that they know from their own experience or something that they learned from an apostle or something like that. So you don't have any of this like process of trying to figure out the order. That's something that like Goodacre is inserting back onto them. But the major problem is that they're not just unanimous that Matthew's the first gospel written, they're also unanimous on that John is the last gospel to have been written. John is also written by an apostle. So if you think that they randomly correlate apostolicity with priority, they should be putting Matthew and John first, but they don't. They put John last. All of them do. And so I think that undercuts basically Goodacre's whole assumption that they thought that it had to be earlier just because it's written by an apostle.
Yeah, interesting.
All right, last segment, internal evidence for the priority of Matthew. The strongest argument from the internal evidence, I think, is going to be the argument from conflation. And I probably need to share my screen again so that people can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is just to give you a kind of idea of the phenomenon that we're going to be dealing with. Basically, what it looks like is there's passages in Mark. There's, I think, 17 of them to be precise, where it looks like Mark is basically mixing Matthew and Luke together. And so I'm going to show you some passages where I've colored the sections from Matthew blue like this, and then the sections from Mark gonna or from Luke rather are going to be colored red within Mark. And so that way you can kind of see starkly how it looks like he's mixing these things together. So here's a popular example of this is going to be in Mark 1, 29 through 34. So I've got Matthew over on the left and I've got Luke on the right. Mark's in the middle here. And I've colored the stuff that matches with Luke red and the stuff that colors with Matthew blue. So you can see how it looks like he's kind of moving in between the two. The reason this is an argument for Mark being written last is because the alternative would be to say that Matthew and Luke independently picked out opposite stuff out of Mark's narrative. If you think Mark is first, then you have to say that like Matthew decided to take like this every other bit out of Mark, and then Luke chose the other half of the stuff that Matthew didn't leave in there. Um, Pretty strange. First of all, definitely incompatible with the two source hypothesis where Luke doesn't know Matthew, because otherwise he's not going to know what stuff Matthew left for him. But like even if he does know Matthew, it's really weird that he would just choose to take all the stuff that Matthew left. And then also like why is Matthew only taking every other line, right? Why is he like does he know Luke is going to come along and take the other half of the stuff? It's just weird that they would feel free to preserve the stuff that the other person didn't, right?
Right. So this appears that what's happening is Matthew has his own version of the story, his own unique telling of it. Luke has his own unique telling of it, and then Mark seems to be pulling sections from each of them to kind of create his own version of the story, but it doesn't even seem. I mean, there's some of it obviously you can see in the white that it's some of it is unique to him, but then some of it seems to be pulling from both of them and merging them together.
Yeah, so he looks like a blend of the two of them. But it gets even better than this, right? We don't just have this sort of phenomenon to deal with. See the part that I've underlined here and italicized? We have this statement, now when evening came after the sun had set. So when you look at actually like known examples of conflated texts, you get this sort of redundancy in there where because like look this is a redundant statement now when evening came after the sun had set. Evening is when the sun sets, right? The sun sets, that's evening. So he's saying the same thing twice here. Now Matthew only has the first half of that, right? Only Matthew has now when evening came. Only Luke has after the sun had set. So it looks like Mark is being redundant as a result of blending these two together. And we just independently know that when authors conflate text together, they tend to be redundant. So that's an additional confirmation that this is probably what Mark is doing here. Uh, and then we also have uniquely Matthean vocabulary turning up in Mark here, right? This phrase, when evening came, this is actually a very rare expression in Greek. It only turns up 7 times in the entire New Testament. 6 of those are in Matthew, and it occurs 1 time in Mark in the passage that we're looking at. So, what we're seeing is that this is a distinctive of Matthew's vocabulary, and it's turning up in Mark, making it a whole lot more likely that Mark is taking this phrase from Matthew than that Matthew is taking it from Mark. Does that make sense?
Yeah, otherwise you'd have to argue that Mark used this rare phrase once. Matthew read it and was like a kid learning a new word and wanted to use it all the time.
Right. Just inductively, we know this is a distinctive of Matthew's vocabulary, and we have Mark using it here. Here's another example of this sort of phenomenon. Not as strong in this case, but this would be Mark 1:42. We have the parallel in Matthew 8:3 and Luke 5:13, right? Mark says, and immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Now, that is a redundant statement again, and we've seen that redundancy is a known characteristic of conflation. Immediately the leprosy left him. That's from Luke. He was cleansed. That's from Matthew. So again, we look like we have a blending of the things together, leading to a redundant sentence. Another example here is in Mark 3:1 through 6. yeah, I mean, I don't have to go through all of these in detail, but I mean, you can kind of see the thing that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with redundancy again. We have another example here in Mark 9. Uh, Again, he's blending, it looks like he's blending Matthew and Luke together. Well, this might be a bit of an interesting case because notice that the part that's taken from Matthew 10 here at the end, or that would be taken from Matthew 10, assuming that Mark is, the third one written, this is actually pulled from a completely different story than in Luke. So Mark and Luke both contain this story of the strange exorcist, and it just doesn't exist in the Gospel of Matthew. But at the end of Mark's version of the story, we have this statement from a completely different part of Matthew that's here in Mark's narrative, and it doesn't exist in Luke's narrative at all. So, in order to sort of maintain Markan priority, what you have to think happened here is that uh, basically Luke decided to so Matthew decided to just take this last part of Mark out, right? And then Luke comes along and he copies the story exactly until he gets to the point that Matthew, started taking parts out. Again, this doesn't bode well for the idea that Mark is the first gospel because it's just too many coincidences.
Yeah, it kind of looks like if you go back to it, well, it would be really it's kind of bizarre that Matthew would be reading this account in Mark and just skip the entire meat of the story and then grab a couple of words that aren't even like a lot of these are in incomplete sentences just to throw into a completely different story that he's writing that has nothing to do with what Mark was talking about. So if he was in fact copying him, it would seem kind of bizarre. But I mean, I guess I could say the same thing for Mark. Like, why in the heck was he just grabbing these random phrases from a different story to
Well, so
stick into his?
it's an odd passage no matter how you look at it, right? But the thing is, like the story in Matthew, you've got like this great one-liner from Jesus, right? Truly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward. So you've got this great one-liner from Jesus, and it supports this story that's in Luke, right? So we could see Mark being like, okay, I think that this like statement, it supports the point of this story in Luke, but I don't want to like include this whole story from Matthew, so I can, have Jesus say it here.
This thing that Jesus said in Matthew's gospel supports the conclusion that he's driving at in his story.
Precisely. Whereas the alternative is you have to say that Matthew just grabbed the one liner out, which, okay, maybe that makes sense, but then makes sense to me of Luke including the whole story except for the one liner. That just so happened to be what, Matthew left out.
Yeah, and was kind of the main point that Mark was driving at. And so if you're just going to
Right,
take
right,
that, then why
right.
did you leave out the punchline?
Precisely. So it's something that works far better if Mark is the third gospel to have been written and he's blending Matthew and Luke together, which again is what my hypothesis entails. Here's another longer example. Mark 14, 12, 21, 12 through 21. You can see how he's blending Matthew and, or looks, at any rate, looks like he's blending Matthew and Luke together. Again, we got like examples upon examples of this, but I think you get the idea. Am I right?
Yeah, is this like how often does this happen in Mark's gospel? I know you showed like 6 or 7 examples back to back. How often does this happen throughout his gospel?
It's 16. We have 16 or 17 examples of this going on in the gospel of.
So almost once per chapter.
It happens frequently, and
Yeah.
it's yeah. So needless to say, the Markan Prioris had to come back with a response. So this argument was developed in like 1977 by a scholar by the name of Thomas Longstaff. He did his whole dissertation basically on this argument. So the Markan Prioris came back with the work of this guy named Christopher Tuckett. And so his response was, he made 2 responses. So first he says, well, look, Mark is just a redundant writer, right? We go through Mark and we have like 215 examples or something of these redundancies in Mark. And so you're pulling on like 17 of them and saying, well, look, the redundancy that results from him conflating them. But look, we have all these other examples where Mark is just redundant on his own. So we know that he's a redundant writer. So that's like not actually the evidence for conflation that you think it is. The problem is the examples where Tuckett was drawing these from, they came from this really old book by the name of this guy, the scholar named Franz Niernick. I think he was like a German scholar. Um, and it doesn't demonstrate what he thinks it does at all. Most of these things aren't even like apparent examples of redundancy. I went through just about all of them, and I found like maybe three that even looked remotely redundant, and they were very different from the sort of redundancies that I was bringing up in the examples that I just showed you. It was one of the examples was the crazy guy at the tombs, where it says like constantly night and day he was screaming among the tombs. Well, yeah, like if he's constantly doing it, then he's doing it night and day. But the point is, it's not as clear as what we are dealing with here. And most of the examples just like it's a very artificially inflated list. You don't have nearly this many redundancies in Mark, like he was trying to say. His other argument is that basically, well, like, look, I can take any text you like and compare it to two other texts and like make a judgment. Is this passage closer to this one? Is this passage closer to this one? And like literally any text you like, I'm gonna get this jumping back pattern if I just make this judgment about is it closer to this text or this one. So he basically said that the pattern we're dealing with, it's sort of forced by the method because you've only got two options. So of course you're going to get this sort of zigzag pattern. The problem there is that it's typically very clear when it's closer to the other gospel because we're dealing with like verbatim agreements in a lot of them. So it's not just something that's forced by the method. And in other cases, we're dealing with stuff that's just not even in the other gospel, like with the strange exorcist and the punchline being added in on the end. The punchline does not exist in Luke. So it's not just a case of me like saying this looks more similar here, here, here. We're actually dealing with cases of stuff that's really different. So far as I know, and I think Tuckett's book came out in like 1979, they have not issued another response to this argument since then. They all just defer, oh, Christopher Tuckett took care of this argument in the 70s. Well, I think that Tuckett's criticisms are really bad. And like if that's all you got, then I think this is a pretty darn strong argument that the Gospel of Mark is a conflation of both Matthew and Luke. So I think that's the strongest internal argument for thinking that Mark is the third gospel. There is a little bit of a question of how does that get you to Matthew being first?
Okay, so I can see how what you're talking about would support the idea that Mark came after Matthew and Luke, but then how do you go from there to Luke or Matthew being first as opposed to, say, Luke?
Yeah. The argument there actually just kind of comes from Luke itself, right? Luke in the prologue says that many others have undertaken to, write an account of the things that are said and done by Jesus, writing to his patron Theophilus, right? So Luke kind of gives evidence already that he's writing a bit later in the game. So actually, the internal evidence to Luke itself suggests that there are already other gospels out there. By contrast, Matthew doesn't really have anything like that. And so, because of that, it's just more likely that Matthew's written first. Obviously, plus the witness of the early church, there's clear reason to think that Matthew's going to be the first one. So, kind of, if you've already concluded that Mark is not the first gospel, then you don't really have a good reason to sort of prefer that Luke is going to be the first one over Matthew in contradiction to the early church. So that's basically the argument for, at that point, saying Matthew's more likely to be first than Luke.
So that's like it's more of an argument, both from you've got the early church father witness and then Luke, what he said too, but that's not like super strong mounting evidence. Is it more just that there is some evidence that Matthew came first and there's no evidence that Luke came first? Like there's no really positive evidence otherwise that Luke would have come first?
There's no good reason to prefer Luke to Matthew, and there are good reasons, even from within Luke itself, saying that he's, depending on other gospels, to prefer that Matthew would be first. Yeah, maybe not the strongest argument ever, but I mean, I don't think there's really any argument to say that that Luke is the first gospel.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So then I'm curious about why is it that so many scholars uh, hold to Markan priority so firmly? And I mean, I understand if that's just all you've known, that's what you've defended, whatever. But why would they be so hesitant or resistant to giving that up for an alternative position?
Yeah, I mean, some of it I think just is the sort of sociological factors that we've already talked about. That there's kind of this institutional, bias, I guess, to rely on consensus. A lot of it is just shoddy reasoning, like we've already talked about. And then I think a lot of it is, I think the church fathers just kind of get dismissed out of the gate without, like, almost without argument. So there's that. And then the arguments for the priority of Matthew are just, they're not widely discussed, they're not widely known. Like most of the discussion in synoptic research is currently, regarding other issues like, maybe was Matthew actually the last gospel written, right? There's not a whole lot of discussion about these arguments. The reason, like Matthean priority, I don't think the arguments for it ever got refuted. What happened is it had like a comeback in the later part of the 20th century, and then kind of the scholars who were defending it, they just started kind of dying off without, having students of theirs who took up the cause for them. So I don't think the arguments were ever refuted. It was just an example of, essentially the scholars who defended it died off.
So I know that you said that Matthean priority kind of bolsters and helps to support arguments for authorship because it's consistent with early church father witnesses as to who the gospel writers were. Is there any sort of similar advantage that Mark and Prioris have that they would then have to give up if they were to leave Mark and priority?
What are you talking about? Like, what kind of similar advantage?
Like for example, you said that there's this advantage that you have to being a Matthean priorist that if you were to be a Markan priorist, you have to give that part of the argument up, at least that advantage, and you'd have to find another workaround. Is there something similar with Markan priorists that they get this advantage from being Markan priority that they then have to give up if they were to leave that to go for Matthean priority, say?
I don't think you'd have anything in the way of an apologetic advantage. You might have an advantage in terms of, like, you wouldn't be asking your audience to go up as strongly against contemporary biblical scholarship. I know some apologists view that as an advantage. Again, I'm sort of the person, I don't really care. But no, I can't think of anything in accepting Markan priority that actually bolsters the case for Christianity.
Okay, I know that J. Warner Wallace has. I've heard some of his apologetic arguments that he's made for the authenticity of the Gospels and things like that. He has kind of couched some of them and in pieces of them, and probably not like deeply rooted in this, but he has mentioned some of the evidence tying back to Mark and priority. And so I'm wondering if you're familiar with that, or if not, I'm going to see if I can find it really quick.
I mean, I recall reading Cold Case Christianity. It's probably been, close to it's probably been going on 10 years now since I've read that book. But so I don't remember real clearly him depending all that much on market priority. But I mean, I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, none of the arguments that he's made, at least that this is pulling up, I just can't remember off the top of my head, but that this is pulling up. None of these arguments are couldn't be used for say Matthew or Luke. It would translate over just fine. So
Yeah, I don't recall anything that he said heavily depending on that. But I mean, again, it has been a good amount of time since I've read Cold Case Christianity.
yeah, he's definitely like more of a popular level apologist, and in which there's I think benefits to both the pop level apologists and then also the I know what you would prefer more like deep. I don't know what. How do you distinguish? What would you distinguish between a popular level apologist and what do you call this other group?
Christian scholarship.
I guess yeah. Okay, you could do that. Yeah, more scholarly apologetics. I think there's benefits to both. I think the popular level is more accessible to the layperson that just doesn't really want to dive into the deeper arguments, and also they're bringing up very pop level arguments that are very surface anyway. So the answers that are given are pretty easy to deal with those. The scholarly apologetics seems to be more beneficial for those who have much deeper questions or take issue or objection with these popular level answers and things like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, the well-rounded apologist should be able to make his case to either, right, the person who's bringing the, bottom shelf lousy objections, or the person who's bringing the, lofty ivory tower objections. Ideally, we would want people to be equipped to do both. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier to address those bottom shelf ones, and it takes a lot of time and study to necessarily, and it's not for everyone, right? Like, not everyone is cut out to, take on the Graham Oppies and the Paul Drapers of the world. Um, so like it's okay to have your area. My bigger issues with popular apologetics is when I think that they're just putting forward like straightforwardly bad arguments, or they're like misrepresenting atheism. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
when I see them doing the kinds of stuff that I don't like it when I see atheists doing it to my perspective. When I see them like saying, oh, like, oh, well, you believe that, God sacrificed himself to save us from himself, or when I see like Christians apologists like Frank Turek saying, "Well, if atheism is true, then you're just a bag of meat and electricity," And like, can we stop it with this? So I don't like these extremely uncharitable descriptions. I don't want my views described uncharitably. Like, I would like atheists to take a little time to understand my position. I want to extend the same charity to them, essentially. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, basically.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have another question for you. And this is sort of similar topic, but maybe a little bit different. What is your opinion on the traditional description that's given of the Gospels in relation to the deity of Jesus? We brought this up a little bit earlier, but like, for example, this is something that you hear all the time is, well, Matthew's presenting Jesus as king, and Mark is presenting Jesus as the suffering servant, and then Luke is presenting him as the Son of Man, and then John is presenting him as the Son of God. I think I got those right, but I know you're familiar with this at least, because this is something that we if nothing else, we both heard it at school and things like that. I don't know that I've really seen a problem with that, but I don't know if there's a better way of looking at those things. The only problem I could see, at least at the moment, would be perhaps an oversimplification. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that if we're sort of describing the emphases of the various gospels, because I mean, the gospel authors have their audiences, they have their own, historical reasons that led to them being written, and so I'm okay with talking about those as emphases. Like, for example, the Gospel of John is kind of written when like Gnosticism is becoming a bit of a thing, right? So there's some pretty evident stuff in the Gospel of John and in the Johannine epistles that's targeting Gnosticism. So it's more important that he present Jesus as being like fully divine, right? It's not that you don't have that in the Synoptics, but it's that that wasn't under fire as much when they were written, so they didn't like specifically have to address that, right? Matthew is very specifically interested in Jewish sorts of concerns, right? Is Jesus really the Messiah? Luke seems to have a predominantly Gentile audience, so he has to present things that will be relevant to their sorts of concerns. On my hypothesis, the Gospel of Mark is written for the unbeliever, right? So he's got more of those sorts of concerns rather than the sort of concerns that believers might have in Matthew and Luke. So I'm perfectly okay with saying that there is a strong emphasis in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus is the King. There's a strong emphasis that he's divine in John. I don't want to say that to the exclusion of the other things. I don't want to give off the impression that Jesus is not divine in the Synoptics. There's a really good book actually on this called "The Pre-Existent Son" by Simon Gathercole, where he kind of tears down the popular idea that Jesus is not divine or is less divine in the Synoptic Gospels, and that they have a robust Christology. It's just as high as in the Gospel of John, it's just not as explicit. So I don't like emphasizing these themes to like the detriment of saying that the other themes are there. It's just a question of emphasis. And so as long as that's all that's being said, and I think typically it is, I'm okay with characterizing the gospels that way, as long as, we're not giving off the idea that there's nothing else there.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
I did have two other arguments for the priority of Matthew.
You go right on ahead.
Well, there's one interesting argument for the priority of Matthew, or at least the posteriority of Mark, based on sort of, so you're familiar, of course, with the Gospel of Mark, right? That there's some controversy regarding when exactly it ends. So this argument assumes that the short ending is correct, that it ends with the women
Okay.
leaving the tomb, and so that you don't actually have appearances of the risen Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. That being the case, there's this question of, if he's the first gospel written and he knows about these resurrection appearances, right? Because the angel says that they're coming, why on earth are they not present in the Gospel of Mark? It's a really weird place to leave off your narrative, is with the women just leaving the tomb and not saying anything to anyone. Matthew and Luke, if these gospels are already written, Mark knows that the material's out there, right? And on my hypothesis, if this is written for unbelievers, this can leave them with a question, right? Make them curious, come to the believers to hear the end of the story. But if Mark is the first gospel written, and this, like, he's the first person writing down the story of Jesus, he's not going to include the resurrection appearances for real? Like, I find that a little bit hard to believe. It makes a lot. I mean, it's weird either way, but it's less hard to swallow if he already knows that these traditions about Jesus's appearance have been written down. So, not as strong as the argument for conflation, but that is another argument that I would make in defense of at least the posteriority of Mark's gospel.
Okay. So, granted, this particular position of the longer ending of Mark is going to be a controversial one, and so based on just let's just take that argument for a second. And if and I've heard it explained that basically the reason for that shorter ending is that what Mark is doing with his story is he's leaving it rather abrupt for a almost like an introspective moment, and he's saying that you're supposed to place yourself in that story, and so whenever it ends suddenly, of like the women, they see the tomb is empty and then they go, and it's kind of like, okay, well, what happens? And it's almost supposed to be like, what are you going to do with this information, in a sense? Now, like you're saying, that would only really work if they knew where to go to get the answer.
And if the answer had already been written down somewhere.
Right. Whether it be going to get that from the Gospels that had already been written with extensive talk about the resurrection appearances and all these different things. And it would also only make sense if they had been exposed to that in some sense. And so now they're being called to action in some way. Like, how the story goes. Now you have to make a decision for yourself. Now, that's a whole nother debate as to whether or not that is in fact what he's doing with that. It's an interpretive issue. And then it's also a textual criticism issue as to whether or not the ending was longer. But this particular argument, it wouldn't make sense for the very first gospel that was written, that is supposed to be giving record of these events, to just not include the most important factor of the events, which is that all of Christianity hangs on the resurrection.
Yeah, because he doesn't know, right? If he's first, he doesn't know that Matthew and Luke are coming down the pike to finish the story. So you're really gonna leave it there and possibly never have the appearances of Jesus written down? I mean, that's crazy to me.
Right. Yeah. And so that argument only works if you're dealing with somebody who agrees that with the shorter ending of Mark as opposed to the longer ending of Mark.
But there's one advantage of this argument, is that virtually all scholars don't accept a longer ending of Mark. So in this,
Really,
yeah, I mean, well, maybe
I thought there was still some heated debate even among the
maybe
scholarship.
virtually all is an overstatement. I'd say the vast majority don't accept the longer ending of Mark. So for most of them, this is an argument they're going to have to deal with.
So
But
it is a useful argument to have because you're likely going to interact with that position anyway.
more than likely, particularly if somebody's heavily relying on scholarly consensus to believe in Markan priority, then, you know,
This kind of works against them. Yeah.
right. Even if you affirm the longer ending of Mark, you could be like, but look, you don't. So what do you deal with? What do you do with this?
Right. Right. Exactly. That's kind of how I like to think of Hugh Ross, and this is a completely different subject, but when it comes to old Earth versus young Earth creation, no matter what your position is, and Hugh Ross gets a lot of hate. Um, it's kind of humorous sometimes to see the level of animosity that people have toward him. But no matter what your position is, whether you're young Earth or old Earth, even if you're a young Earth creationist, you should at least recognize that Hugh Ross and old Earth creationists are a tremendous asset to you in that you may not agree with them. However, the majority of skeptics that you're going to be dealing with will not hear you out on young Earth creationists on young Earth creation because they think that you're opposing the science. And so to have Hugh's arguments in your back pocket to be like, okay, you may not agree with me, but what are you going to do with this? He does agree with you, and he's come to the opposite conclusion as you. So now what? Like it doesn't give them an out that they're looking for, and that's
Or
kind of what you're
at least
saying
not an
here.
easy out. Yeah.
Yeah, it removes that out for even in scholarship to say, oh well, you believe in the shorter ending of Mark, and yet that doesn't make sense for your with your Mark and priority. So that's interesting. That's fascinating. And you had one other reason.
One other argument I'll give here, based on internal evidence, for again, at any rate, the posteriority of Mark to Matthew, is that there's a lot of like things you would have like if you think that Matthew's written after Mark, then there's a lot of really weird things that he leaves out that we would expect him to include in there just based on certain things that we know about like his own tendency. So the author of the Gospel of Matthew, he likes precise numbers. He likes numbers and he likes money. This, I think, is also an argument, by the way, that it's written by Matthew the tax collector. But put that aside for a moment. Whoever you think the author of the Gospel of Matthew is, this guy likes his numbers and he likes his money. Okay. We have examples of this, like in his own unique material, where he just goes out of his way to mention this kind of stuff, right? So Matthew has like the gospel, or has the parable rather, of the unmerciful servant who's forgiven a debt of 10,000 talents, right? And he forgives to give a debt, or he refuses to forgive a debt of 100 denarii, right? That's Matthew 8:21 through 35. Matthew contains the parable of the landowner who agrees to pay his workers a denarius for the day, Matthew 21 through 16. Matthew is the gospel where we find the story of Peter finding a shekel in a fish's mouth. So he likes to be very specific with his references to money, particularly different types of coins, right? He talks about the quadrante, right? He talks about the asarion, the drachma, the stater, the denarian. Uh, he's it's in Matthew's gospel that we have Jesus stressing, right, that the disciples aren't to bring any gold, silver, or copper with them when they're ministering to the surrounding villages. So Matthew's unique material, he brings up numbers, he brings up money. These are his bread and butter. He likes to talk about that stuff. So despite him having this tendency, there are a couple of off instances where Matthew gives like a vague description, and Mark says something specific about numbers and money, right? So Mark, if I could read my own handwriting here. So yeah, Mark references the ointment and bread being worth 300 denarii in Mark 14:5, right? Matthew just doesn't have that. He doesn't have a specific reference there. But if Matthew's using Mark, we would expect him to include that detail. That's the kind of stuff that would catch his attention. Mark makes this very precise reference to there being 2,000 pigs that run over the hill in Mark 5:13. But in Matthew, we just have this vague reference to the whole herd in Matthew 8:32. If Mark wrote first, then we're expected to believe that Matthew just decided to delete the whole story of the widow who gives two small copper coins in Mark 12:41 through 44. None of that accords with the tendencies that we know about the author of the Gospel of Matthew. He likes to mention money, he likes to mention numbers, and yet we've got these three examples in Mark where Mark actually has the precise number of something or other or a specific type of coin, and Matthew deletes it or changes it into a vague reference. That doesn't comport with what we know about the author of the Gospel of Matthew. And of course, it's even stronger if you suppose that he was a Matthew the tax collector, as I think he was. But you don't even really need that to make the argument. You can just point to all of the other examples in Matthew to show that, yeah, he was pretty interested in that sort of stuff. So that'd be the last argument. Again, I don't think it's as strong as the argument from conflation, but it's certainly something to consider.
Yeah, I mean, none of these arguments necessarily is a silver bullet. I mean, some of them are much stronger than others, like the conflation thing that you're talking about. But as you began taking all of these into consideration collectively, makes a pretty solid case for Matthean priority as opposed to Markan priority. So if you could really quick run through each of the
Bullet point.
yeah, maybe start with the Markan priority and the reason, like really quick, the arguments that are given and why each one of them is bad, and then your Matthean priority arguments, just really quick as a summary to bring everything together.
Yeah. So basically, the structure of it is early church basically just gets thrown out of the door for most people, and they just think, well, arguments for Markan priority, it's so overwhelming. So I kind of begin there, show that the arguments aren't that good, reconsider the early church, and then look at the internal evidence. So yeah, basically you have the argument from order, which just says that it looks like Matthew and Luke follow Mark's pericope order. The big problem with that is it's a reversible argument. You can turn it around and understand it just as easily the other way. The second argument was argument from Semitisms. We saw that there's a conceptual problem. It assumes that the inclusion of Semitisms means that it's closer to the event, but there's actually no reason to agree with that. And then also, it's just not true that Mark has more of these than Matthew or Luke. Argument from Christology. Supposedly, Mark has lower Christology than Matthew or Luke. We saw a problem is that it assumes that low Christology was what was the original belief, and that high Christology developed over time, but that's refuted by the Apostle Paul. And then, just more fundamentally, Mark doesn't actually have a low Christology. And there's also some cherry picking going on, because you can find examples where it looks like Matthew actually has the lower Christology if you buy into the sorts of reasons that they're giving for that. You have the arguments from Mark's mistakes and Matthew's mistakes, and we saw this is basically a case of, heads I win, tails you lose. It's just it all gets interpreted as Markan priority no matter what, even though it's literally incompatible to have it be both ways. Argument from additions and omissions is basically the idea that there's certain stuff in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that Mark certainly would have included if it had been available to him. But that assumes that Mark is trying to include all of the material that is available to him. And there's actually good reasons from Mark itself to think that he's not trying to include all of the information that he has in his gospel. Then you have the argument from Editorial Fatigue, which basically says you've got continuity errors in Matthew and Luke, which we could explain if they made a change to Mark's narrative and then forgot that they made that change and copied something in later on. First, I argue that we don't actually have to admit that there are these continuity errors in the first place. It's perfectly reasonable to make the narratives consistent. And then beyond that, the argument's also reversible. You could just say that this is a case of, Matthew or of Mark fixing Matthew and Luke's narratives. You don't have to say that they, forgot that they made a change and then 2 seconds later, or rather that they make a change and then forget that they do it 2 minutes later. So if the case for Markan priority is not actually all that strong, I say let's reconsider the early church. The early church is absolutely unanimous that Matthew's the first gospel to be written. There's Possibly some disagreement on the order of Matthew, or rather of Luke and Mark. But I think the strongest evidence actually indicates that Luke is the second gospel and Mark is the third gospel. And when we look at the internal evidence, this is borne out most strongly in the argument from Conflation, where it looks like Luke or Mark is blending Matthew and Luke together. The alternative to this is to say that Matthew and Luke somehow independently know to preserve opposite parts of Mark's narrative, and that's kind of quite a coincidence. Or you're saying that Luke is like very carefully reading Matthew and being like, oh, he took those parts out of Mark, so I'm going to take these parts out. It's just not very plausible that that's what's going on. You have the argument from the shorter ending of Mark, that it doesn't seem likely that Mark would, if he's the first one writing, that he would fail to include the resurrection appearances of Jesus and thereby risk them never being recorded. And then lastly, you have the argument from basically Matthew's love of money and precise numbers, because he typically has those, but we've got a few instances where actually Mark has them instead. And if Matthew was dependent on Mark, this is material he would have loved to include in his own narrative. So that's kind of a briefish summary of my case for the priority of Matthew.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. That's great. I would like to say, given we've gone over the case here, you've gone over this a lot further, much deeper, much more detail on your channel over at Faith Because of Reason. So if anybody wants to dive into this deeper, you can go over there and check that out. You have a lot more sources, a lot more quotations, and kind of parse things out.
And
Very,
I
very
have response videos to people who have been critical of my case.
yes. So you've had some debates there and things like that. And again, I'm opening this up to if anybody wants to debate you on this issue or have like a moderated conversation on it. I would love to host it. And I would like to see if there are legitimate, genuine, strong arguments against your position that we haven't heard today. I would love to hear those. I'd be very interested in hearing the conversation there. And so if there's any serious inquiries or challenges there, then let's do it. But are there any books that you want to recommend on this subject if people want to do more reading on this issue?
Yeah, well, if you just want like a short book, I think it's under 100 pages, but a nice little kind of overview of the case. It would be Why Four Gospels by David Allen Black. It's very short, easy book. Just if you want to kind of explore the controversy a little more, there's a book by Baker. It's called Four Views on the Synoptic Problem. You can kind of see the views interact with each other in there. So yeah, if you're kind of looking to see what does the other side have to say, that might be the sort of book that interests you. If you want a book that I found immensely helpful, it's called The Progressive Publication of Matthew by B. Ward Powers. It's a thick book. I mean, it's like 700-800 page book, but it's very comprehensive, and I think it's probably the most up to date. I think it's published in 2010. It's probably the most up to date case for Matthean priority that you're likely to find. Unfortunately, Dr. Powers himself passed away a couple years ago, which is unfortunate. But I think his work stands. It's a very good contemporary case for yeah. There's a whole bunch of other books I could recommend, but I think those would probably be three good ones for people to start with.
Mm-hmm. And I'll include those down in the description. And if you send me a list of other books, I can include those too if you want to, just for people to be able to check out and look at. So I am curious, really quick. One last question that I have for you is: do you find that Matthean priority is a position that is growing in popularity, is kind of just there and is what it is, or have you seen any movement there in the scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, it had a little bit of a comeback in the late 20th century. Like I said, it was due to a guy named William Farmer. He inspired a lot of students. They took up the cause for it. Like I said, unfortunately, they kind of retired or died out towards the end of the 21st century. There are still a few people out there who take up the case for it, like David Black, for example. He's still around. Ward Powers just recently passed away. There are a couple young bucks, actually, I've been told about recently. There's a couple of young up and coming people who are potentially going to take up the case for it. But as of right now, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that there is a lot in the way of contemporary scholarship that's really defending it. Most of the fights right now are between people who believe in Q and like fairer hypothesis guys who don't. That's where most of the fighting has happened. But like I said, I think there's I think basically there's Matthean priority is strongly poised to have a comeback because the arguments for it have not been refuted from what I have seen, right? Like I have tried my dead level best to look at what are the skeptics saying. I've tried to read their arguments. I've critiqued them in my own videos. I don't think that the case for Matthean priority has been refuted. I think the proponents of it have just died off. So there's no reason it couldn't have a comeback. And I think like there are some glimmers that we have some younger people who might try to bring it back. But as of right now, yeah, it's probably considered a almost dead or dying theory by most.
Hmm. And the way that this would make a comeback is people becoming educated on it, because most people are just like me. They've only heard one position their whole life, didn't know that there was an alternative out there. And hearing these arguments, it seems very compelling. So I guess becoming educated on the issue and then teaching, those that are coming up under you, that there is alternative positions to this and some good arguments there.
And I just think New Testament studies needs a massive overhaul. You really just need people to stop. There's got to be some revolutionary thinking there. It's too old school, too dependent on I think really bad, like deeply, like the rot goes deep in New Testament studies.
And
So
what do you mean? You mean like people are just have there's these common arguments that everybody has just kind of held on to and not really revised?
I think it's deeper than that. I think New Testament studies is it's strangely motivated by a desire to like have like conclusions that favor the non-authenticity. Like anything that is not favorable to Christianity is there's like a strange preference for it in the name of like being objective. Like we have to be objective scholars and like if you have anything that's like supportive of Christianity, that has to be dismissed as like that's apologetics, that's fundamentalism. It gets tagged with all these labels. There is just
Even among Christian scholarship?
unfortunately, we do have people like Mike Lacona and like Gary Habermas who really want to like cuddle up for whatever reason to mainstream scholarship, and they think it's really important for, I mean, I think terrible reasons. That's a whole nother can of worms I won't get
Yeah, I was
into.
just say, is this kind of like what you were touching on last time we talked about the presuppositional apologetics, in that they're starting from a place of what can we all agree on first, and then we'll move on from there. And they kind of take the arguments for Christianity that stand on their own, and they push those to the side in favor of, well, let's just all start from the same place and then argue. Is that kind of what you're talking about, instead of standing on the strength of these arguments by themselves that they have?
Lacona and Habermas certainly like seem to do that. Like the whole minimal facts argument for the resurrection is like, well, here are like these facts that all scholars agree on, and then I'm gonna try to like go from there to get to the resurrection of Jesus. But like I don't want to go up against scholarship on this stuff. So I'm going to accept whatever they accept and then show you can get to the resurrection of Jesus from there. Right now, nominally, I'm not sure about Lacona. Habermas, at least, like is willing to disagree with the scholars on this. He just thinks like even if like I can adopt this and still get to the resurrection of Jesus, that's what he says in word. But I mean, there are enough quotations from him floating around out there that I found that I think he actually does think that like there is some sort of evidential significance to be found in the fact that most scholars agree on it. Because his assumption is if most scholars agree on it, then they have to have good reasons for doing so. I fundamentally do not agree with that. I don't think that because most of them accept it, that therefore they have good reasons to. And again, there's so many examples like the one I gave from the argument from order of just like patently fallacious arguments running rampant in the field of New Testament studies where people become enamored with them. And yeah, so I think it just the whole field of New Testament studies needs a major overhaul. It needs to like refresh and reset. And if that were to happen, Lord willing, I have a feeling Matthean priority could be viewed a lot more positively.
This is the kind of thing that you address in your resurrection series too, wasn't it? That there's this tendency among scholarship to start from this, like, not utilize the arguments that we have that are not agreed on by scholars, because those have strength, but it tends to be like those are set aside, and instead of taking these arguments that are uh, they take these arguments that are given by skeptics and by atheists and people that don't agree with it, and they start from this position of like, oh, let's find our agreement here, and then we'll move on to proving it from those agreements, rather than just saying, well, no, I can prove that the scholarship is just wrong on this, and trusting in the strength that we have in the arguments themselves, rather than trying to tie ourselves and depend on secular scholarship and think that, oh, well, we have to agree with them, otherwise we're just biased.
Yeah. And if we do that, I mean, we can get out of this like defensive posture that it feels like a lot of Christian biblical scholarship is like tied with like one hand behind their back, just trying to like we're just trying at all costs to like preserve Christianity somehow against what, the scholars have discovered. I don't like that posture, it's like we've got an ugly girlfriend, that we're like just trying to like, no, just, shut her away. Don't look like no, like Christianity, it's defensible, it's rational, it's robustly rational. We can go on the offensive against biblical scholarship. It's totally fine. We don't have to worry about looking credible to the rest of the world and like playing by their rule book. It's a bizarre posture that a lot of popular Christian apologists have unfortunately adopted, and it's one reason I've tried to be more vocal against it. I don't think we have to play the defensive. We can go on the offensive against biblical scholarship, and we can come out the winners.
Yeah, well said. All right, cool. Well, I think that wraps up our time for today. So appreciate you coming on here and joining me again so soon, and presenting this. I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a long time, and I'm glad we've had the opportunity to do it. Um, Hope people will find it helpful. But from there, I don't have anything else to add. So unless you do, then we will say peace out and see you next time.